Hey all, welcome back to another Dorico video. Today we're going to be following up on my pretty popular video about score formatting and page formatting, and we're going to be dealing with parts this time. Now, part formatting is potentially even more important than the score formatting, but this is something that really can be very time consuming, but I found some really cool tricks, and again, Dorico has some amazing tools when it comes to this. So here we are with a quick dive into part formatting. Okay, so I'm getting ready for a performance and a lecture at Washington State University for a Modern Composers Forum, and so I'm looking at my composition here entitled Bang. My daughter and I worked on this semi-recently, and so that's the other title credit there. And so I was trying to make some parts for all of the players. And to me, it's so important that my parts look really, really nice because I figure one of the ways of not only making the musicians respect me as an artist is to make their job easier so that they really feel like I took this very seriously. I put a lot of work into the music and I made it easy for them to just step right in and jump on the music and play it wonderfully. And these are great performers I'm going to be working with, some of which I've performed and recorded with many, many times. And so I know that they really appreciate the hard work that goes into these part formats. So let's take a look at this. So in Dorico, when we create a score, automatically parts are created for all the different players in our piece of music. Now notice I said players and not instruments. Now if you haven't checked this out yet, in Dorico, let's say you wanted to have a doubling part, so the first alto is going to double on flute, for example. That's why you have players versus instruments, because one player can play multiple different instruments. And so it's really important to kind of establish that. So I know like in Finale, we used to create a part and then we'd add multiple staves to it. But in this, it's actually an automatic thing. So if I was to go ahead and add, say, a flute part to this alto sax, you'll see that underneath the player, it's now called alto sax and flute. And I could change that name if I wanted to, simply by double clicking on it. But what it means is there's now going to be an additional stave in the part, and it gives me the opportunity to write things out. Now notice please on the score, nothing changed. There's no flute line. How do we do this? So if we go down to gallery view, you'll see that we'll get access to the extra parts that were added. So now that we're in gallery view, you can see that the flute part is visible. And what it means is we can add in flute notes wherever we need them. And then when we go to the actual part itself, you'll see that at that point in the composition, it'll tell me, oh, this is flute. And then it'll say 2 alto sax. And notice that it didn't put in 2 lines because we don't need 2 lines. So it automatically knows to do the instrument switch, which is really cool. Now, I know that's not really part of this video, but that's just like a little hint there. Maybe in a future video we'll talk about that further. But again, if you're going to have doubling parts, you do it per the player, and then you can add them in the gallery view of your score, because in the gallery view you can see all the parts possible. And if you go back to the page view, you can see it does it like it does in the part where we can't see it anymore. So that's kind of a quick difference. So let's go ahead and get rid of that flute part that we really didn't need in the first place. Okay, so now that our part's back to normal, let's go into the Engrave menu and start taking a look at the parts. Now, when you go to Engrave, you have the options of viewing the score and any of the parts. Now, the parts and the score are visible up here in this dialog box, but if you get used to it, Shift Option on the Mac, and I believe it's Shift Control on the PC, will allow you to scroll through your parts one at a time. There's also some very cool zoom features. If you hold down Option Command and hit 0, that's going to zoom so that you see one full page. And so sometimes when I'm doing part formatting, I'll do that view so I make sure I see an entire page and so I'm not missing anything. Like for example, if I zoomed way in, I could hit that and bam, it'll take it back to that zoom level. I can also, there is one that's pretty cool. You can actually assign a version where you can see 2 whole pages at once. Now, I created my own shortcut for that where I hold down all the option keys and hit T. Now, that's a custom one that I did, and in a later video, I'll show you how to do those custom shortcuts. But this is a really cute, cool view. And if you want to see that, you can go under View and under the Zoom menu, and that's where I created that custom shortcut for myself. But I'm going to go ahead and get back to the topic at hand, which is the parts. So if I go to my first part, say the alto sax, the first thing I want to do is I want to make the flow work right. Now, there's a couple of things that Dorico does that are really awesome and a couple of things that are a little problematic. The first one you can see here is Dorico is not very good at observing where the title is versus where your music is. And you can see that I have a collision up here. And Dorico's not going to do anything about that. You're actually going to have to fix that yourself. And there's a couple of different ways we can do it, but I always like to do the automatic things if I can help it. Now, in this case, what's happened is that my music goes too high up on the page. And there's actually a great formatting for that, which is if we go under our layout, which is Shift-Command-L, and then we go down under Page Setup, and you can see we can scroll down to the one that is called Music Frame Margins. And the Music Frame Margins is the box that holds the music and how much room is given on the top and the bottom of that. And in this case, I have it set to 0.3, which I believe is the normal default. But because we're running into our title up there, I need to go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go 0.5. And then if I hit apply, you can see that it pushed the music down so that it's no longer bumping into our title. And so if I had a lyricist or if I was bumping into my composer, this is the best way to move the top line of music down. And if we were bumping into the copyright on the bottom, we could take care of the bottom too by changing this value. And so you can see it moved everything up from the bottom. Now, that wasn't a problem in this particular score, so I'm going to go ahead and put that one back, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that top one in place so that we have no longer that vertical collision. Now, the next thing that you're going to always bump into, and I wish I had a better solution for this because I feel like it's a little problematic in Dorico, which is that measure markers and other text items are always battling for which one's on top and which one's on bottom. And so one thing that happens a lot, and you can see it's happening right here, is this text item here is running into our tempo marking, which is pushing our measure marker way up, or our rehearsal marker, excuse me, which is also pushing up this text block. So there's a couple of workarounds that I always like to look at. And the first thing I always try to decide is, can I put in a system break or move some measures to kind of spread things out a little bit? So I might be tempted to, while I'm in Engrave, click on the first note or the first object in this measure and put in a system break. Because when I put in the system break, what happens is it moved this line of music down to the next line. That's what a system break is, not to be confused with a frame break. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it allowed these elements to come down. Now you might think, well, that just kind of spread the music out and kind of squished things more. But it did allow me to maybe put my frame margin for my music back up to the 0.3. And look at that. Now I can create a little more white space on the page because I let that first line of music go back up again. So that's a really great, handy thing to do. The other thing I like to do, I think it's good for visual acuity on the page, is I like it, if I can, to have my rehearsal markers over on the left side, because then they're not typically bumping into anything. And you can always adjust the heights of these, how far up you are. You can see that in my default settings, my rehearsal letter is low enough that it's actually cutting off the top of my treble clef because of the font set I'm using. Now, if you used a smaller font set, it probably wouldn't do that. But if you do need to adjust that, that's under the Engrave menu under Rehearsal Marks. And you'll see as you scroll down, eventually you'll come to the height. And if I set this to, say, 4 spaces, you can see that it brought it up just enough so now it's no longer touching my treble clef. And I know that one is one that's a little harder to remember, but that one can be really useful. But sometimes it's nice to go ahead and keep that a little lower, because if we weren't talking about where it was on the page on the left side, cutting off that treble clef, we may not want it floating too high above the stave. Now, by default, in Dorico, rehearsal markers and such are typically kind of small, and I really like them to be kind of big and super obvious, but you can see in this chart, these might be a little bit big. So if you're finding that your rehearsal markers are a little too big and you'd like to make them a little smaller, that's under Library, and it's under the Paragraph Styles. And so if we go in here and we scroll down and we find rehearsal marks, you can see I have it set to 14. And the staff relative is important, because if you were to set that to absolute, that means when you adjust the size of your stave, aka you zoom in and zoom out, then those won't change, which can kind of be a little irritating. Because if I want the music nice and small, I'd kind of like my numbers to come with it. So I'm going to keep it that way, but maybe I'm going to take it down to 13. And that wasn't a huge change, so let's go ahead and try that again and see what would happen if we changed it to, say, 11. And now you can see I got it quite a bit smaller, which allowed quite a bit more space on the page. And you can see it really didn't hurt the layout too much. So maybe I'll go back in there, and because I made them a little bit smaller, maybe I'll go ahead and change it in another way, meaning maybe I'll take it back up to 11.5. You can also see that there is one here that says size in parts. Ooh, what does that mean? Well, if I change this to size in parts to let's say 18, make it kind of ridiculous, and I hit OK, you can see they're humongous now in the part. But if I go back to the score, oh, they're nice and small. So that's a really nice touch there in Dorico, where you can have the two different ones, which is really cool. Again, it's under the paragraph styles, and you can see that they're not that much bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. I'm going to go to 14 in my parts, and brings it back down again. Now, scanning over this part, you can see again, I have a measure marker that's kind of floating, because this one line, which is sort of hanging off in the end, is pushing that measure marker up because of this text block. So I'm going to go ahead and fix this by hitting Moves Next System, which creates a system break. You can see it there. And look at that. It kind of spaced everything out better because we didn't have that collision. Now, Dorico by default probably won't let the two be on top of each other, but when it does that stacking thing, it really wrecks the overall aesthetic of your part. So that's one of the things I look for all the time when I'm looking at part formatting is, do I have items stacking on top of each other that are pushing the lines apart? Now, the other thing I always try and look at in parts is I would like the note heads to be as big as I can while maintaining as few pages as I can. So oftentimes I'll go under my page setup and I'll go up to my space size. And again, this is kind of like a zoom for the part. So the larger the space size, it makes the notes bigger, which makes everything bigger with it. So again, it's not just a note head thing or just a stave thing. It actually blows everything up when we do this. Save the titles and the other text on the page. And I don't mean the ones attached to the staves. I mean like the title and the part name and stuff. So let's go ahead and see what happens if I send this up to like part size 1, for example. Now you can see, boy, this part's stupendously readable. However, look at that. We now have vertical collisions. One of the things that Dorico's not great at is pushing the staves apart when you get these kind of weird vertical collisions. So anytime I change the space size, I almost always have to change the vertical spacing to match. So I'm going to go back under my layout, and I'm going to go down to vertical spacing. And remember, the one that we need is inner space gap. That's line to line. Because remember, the one here where you'd think, oh, staff to staff, but those are the staves in a score. So like the first alto part and the second alto part, that's their space. But in this case, we're dealing with individual systems, so we need to increase that. So I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to, say, 10. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I do have some things I don't like a repeat sign here that's the last measure on, or the last measure on a line. I think that's just really hard to read. So I'm going to go ahead and push that down to the next system. And so I get a little nicer flow there. And then I'm going to look around and make sure I don't have any weird collisions or anything. So the part's looking pretty good now, and I'm even okay with my coda system being like this, but I could push it down if I wanted to put a system break there, you can see, but now it triggered the auto justification on the part, which I don't like. So if I wanted to fix that, I could go back under layout, and under the vertical justification, you can see it's set to 60, and you can see my page was 62% full, which means it triggered. So maybe I'd turn that up to 75%, and so now it'll go back to the regular spacing. Now, I have an orphan measure here, which looks kind of weird, so maybe I would go ahead and push this stuff up into that system. And now it's looking really nice. And Dorico does do this auto indent for coda systems, which is really handy. And it also does the thing you saw earlier where the coda system was separated from the other one. And I kind of like it this way, and especially if I was going to keep it on 2 pages, because now it really flows nicely. And you can see that everything's looking great. Now, it is true that if I went back under the Layout tab, while I was changing any one of these individual settings, I could have selected multiple different parts, and I can change one setting, and it'll change for all of those parts at once, which is really handy. However, if I spend 20-30 minutes making the alto part look perfect, having to go back and remember all the things I changed would be such a headache. So Dorico provided us with an amazing tool for copying part formatting from one part to the other. The problem is they put it in my opinion, maybe one of the weirdest places ever, but once you know where to look, it's like, oh. So where we're going to go is under the Setup tab. Over here on the right, you have Layouts. And the layouts are kind of what Dorico uses for making parts. And so a layout is the printed version of the music you're doing. That's kind of its code word for it, if you will. It doesn't really matter how they came up with that term, but it's important to note that it's different than the players. The players are the people playing the instruments and the parts on the staves, and then the layouts are the things that you're actually looking at. But if I right-click on my alto sax layout, you can see there's this option there that says Propagate Part Formatting. And propagate means copy. And so if we click on that, we can see we want to copy from this part, and then we can choose the ones where we want it to go. I don't need to do the alto sax part, but it would be nice to do it to all the other parts. And so if I highlight them all, and then I hit OK, if I was to now go back to Engrave and go to the next part, you're going to see, look, the font size is the same, the frame spacing is the same, and it actually preserved all of my different system breaks. Now, there is a little problem with what we did, because you'll notice that the alto sax part looks pretty darn good. Everything looks about where it needs to be. I don't see a lot of crowding. And then I go here to the bari sax part. Again, everything looks pretty okay. And then I go to the guitar, not too bad. But then the piano looks terrible, right? It's all mashed up and everything looks weird. And some of my spacing is wrong. And then if I go to the bass part, look at that. It's all mashed together. And the reason for it is we actually told Dorico to preserve all of our frame and system breaks. And sometimes this is really handy. Like, for example, if you're doing a big band chart, and let's say all the trumpets basically play all the same rhythms and all the same measures, and they look almost identical, save the notes they're playing. This would be a really cool thing. But if the parts diverge like that, it isn't really that cool. So what we needed to have done is when we went to that setup menu, and I'm going to go back to the setup menu here, and I'm actually going to show you another quick trick so that we can take it back to where it was. Under Edit, if we hit History, this is all the things that we've done since I opened up the file and beyond. And there's all sorts of different things it's saved. But the one we want to undo is this propagate part formatting. So if I click on the one before that and hit OK, it's going to undo everything that was done when I did that propagate part formatting. And the reason I'm showing you this is, let's say you did 6 or 7 things, realized it was a huge mistake, you could go back in here and undo them all at once. So here we go, we hit this, and it'll take a second because Dorico has to undo quite a bit of stuff, but you can see all my parts are back to where they were. Now if I go to Setup again, and I go over to Alto Sax, and I right-click, and I go to the Propagate Page Formatting again, but this time I'm going to select my parts, but I'm going to uncheck System Formatting. So now when we go to the next part, you can see that they are the right sizes, but since it didn't impose the system breaks and everything that I had created, what it did is it allowed us to be able to choose now, oh, well, see, we have an orphan measure there. So I could go ahead and put in my system break, and now it looks better. Oh, but look, my measure number is getting squished there because of the frame of my music. So I'd have to fix that, but I can go through and I can do all these formatting things that I might have wanted to do. Because see, look, in this case, we had a vertical collision because on this page 2, everything was too high up. It's not perfect if you don't copy over the other part of the formatting, but it gets us a lot closer. And I typically, when I do that propagate, I don't bring over the system break things because sometimes it means I have to like delete all of them. And if you do need to delete all of them, notice please over here you have this one that says reset layout. So if you want to just send it back to no system breaks, nothing like that, if you hit reset layout, boom, it will go back to where it was. Now, on this part, again, you can see we have some vertical collisions and we have some funky spacings going on. Now, I can't explain why, but sometimes there's a little bit of a strange gremlin in Dorico where if the inner system spacing is just wrong, I don't even know how to say, it'll create these weird extra spaces and stuff like that. So to fix this part, the first thing I'm going to do is going to go back to the page setup, and I'm going to increase that top margin for the music frame because you can see everything was getting squished at the very top there. So that removed that collision between number 33 and my page number on the top there. But now we still have this strange space here. So typically when I see strange spaces like that, I'm going to go under my vertical spacing, and I'm going to go under my inner space. I'm just going to change this to 9, pretty close to 10, and see what happens. Okay, so that fixed this page, but it didn't do anything for page 1. So we'll have to try this one again, and let's go down to 8 and see if that gets us into the ballpark. Nope, we got something going on here. So there's something between these two systems that's causing Dorico to think there's a problem. And you can also see that now my spacing is just too small and everything's getting kind of squished. So that's obviously not working for me either. Now again, sometimes when we're doing these parts, we'll get some of these little kind of, I'll call them gremlins, where sometimes Dorico just does not want to let go to a spacing issue. Now, in part formatting, I find this sometimes to be a little irritating. Like here, between 13 and the next treble clef, that's bigger than it needs to be. There seems to be nothing in there. So again, once in a while, if you're noticing that there is some odd spacing going on, like here, there's this giant gap for no reason. Sometimes it's the automatic resolve of collisions that's happening, and for some reason Dorico thinks there's something bumping into another thing, which there's clearly not. And so once in a while I'll have to turn that off on certain parts, or turn it way down. Like maybe I'll take it down to half on both of these just to see if that gets it to behave itself. But you can still see it's a relatively big gap, and then it kind of squished these other lines. So if you're really having troubles, go ahead and just turn that off, because then it's going to make you fix the problem using inner system spacing, which sometimes can be just as good. And if you really get desperate, over here on the left, this staff spacing tool. If you just need to move that staff down a little bit, you can grab it and pull it down. However, it's going to kind of make that that's kind of a set in stone thing. So for example, if I make a really big space there, not only did it move these farther apart, but it also crushed these ones. And so now, even if I go in and I change some of my automatic settings, it still isn't going to kind of fix that problem because it made it relatively bigger. But if you just need to tweak it ever so slightly, sometimes that's the only way to get it to really behave itself. So use that as your discretion, see what you can do, but once in a while there's just those little things that are hard to deal with. If you do a manual adjustment and realize you don't like it, if you go back in, you click on the box, now that it's highlighted, you hit delete and it will take it away. So there is ways of getting rid of that, but again, sometimes it's just difficult. Some parts just don't like to behave themselves. Another element you can do in the Engrave menu that is totally unique to Engrave is in the right menu, when you move something, it moves it by these predefined units and eighth notes and grids. But in the Engrave tab, you can grab an object like this measure marker and you can move it anywhere. So if you just need to move something ever so slightly to make a little more room, you can grab it in this menu and do it. Now, this does not apply to every single part, and so you got to be a little careful when you're doing it, but sometimes it's just like the only way to get something to fit on one page if you really need to move something out of your way. So remember, that's another cool tool. In the note spacing, if you need to change a note, you actually need to highlight it, and then on the Mac, you're going to hold down Option and push the arrow key. And you can see what it's doing is it's kind of removing white space, and it's sort of crushing everything around it. But notes that are beamed together, see, that's how I can put a little extra space in there. Say if one of the flags just won't get out of the way of a rest or something. So you do have these really finite controls. And again, if you want to clear it, if you just click on the red box and then hit the delete key, it will remove that manual adjustment. So again, you can adjust the systems up and down, and you can also adjust the note spacing. And then when you have it clicked on this little quarter note looking tool, that's when we can grab any element in the music and we can drag it around individually to make the part formatting work just a little bit better. Now, let's say you were making a really complex part and you really wanted to have just a little bit of information on page one so that you could make fewer page turns. That's where the frame break comes in. If you do a frame break, what that means is it's going to say, hey, I'm going to push everything from that point forward to the next page or the next frame. And so that's the point of the frame break. Now, I know in modern music we don't do this a lot, and we used to do it a lot in hand-done music from years ago, but that was a really great way of kind of moving things around. You can also use this make frame option over here, and what that does is it creates a whole new frame with the thing that you selected so that now we can kind of build our own like little page, or if we wanted to have just a little part on its own little section, that's just another way of doing that. The make into system is the kind of a similar thing. If I click on that and I hit make into system, you can see it made that one thing that I had selected into its own system. And I know that seems like it may not be a very useful tool, but once in a while it comes up. The ones I use the most, though, are Create System Break and this Move Previous Up and Down. That's a really handy tool. It was kind of like in Finale when we hit the up arrow and the down arrow. And I like oftentimes to make it so, especially on rhythm section parts, there's an even number of measures on each system. Now, if you want to default to that, just so you know, if we go back to the layout option, under Staves and Systems, if we scroll down, you'll see that we have, under Casting Off, I'm not sure why that's there, but if you fix that to 4 measures per, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Reset Layout, you can see that it put 4 measures on each line, which in this part actually looks really good. So that saved me a ton of time. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. It's really great. I also launched a Patreon page that I'm going to start filling up here really soon. I am going to be doing a giveaway for some mouthpieces that I've been reviewing and trying out recently. So make sure you check back on the channel, both here and Patreon, to see when that's happening. So if you are a saxophonist, you won't miss out. But other than that, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.